a debrief on the topical lecture that occurred at 12 p.m. today. It was the McGovern Behavioral Science Award lecture that was presented to Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett. It was called Variation is the Norm, about Darwin's insights and the science of emotion. And so we'll be talking with Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett, who is the University Distinguished Professor at Northeastern University in the Department of Psychology with appointments at Massachusetts General Hospital and Harvard Medical School. So I think the first thing that I wanted to ask was the roots of this talk. In my opinion, having worked with you for a while, may have come very early on in your work, as early as your dissertation work. This idea that variation is the norm and that replicability might not be exactly what behavioral scientists think it is.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think one of the things I noticed early on as a graduate student, the first thing you do as a graduate student is you attempt to replicate published
For sure.
papers. And the first 8 experiments that I tried to replicate actually failed. And my first assumption was that I just wasn't cut out to be a scientist and that maybe there was a problem there. But when I took a look at the data for my first 8 experiments, what I noticed was what seemed to be replicating actually was that there was I was observing variation in phenomena that wasn't supposed to be there according to the knowledge of the day, but the variance was replicating. And this actually, I thought kind of naively that I would just focus on this for a month or two, tidy up the methods, and then get back to work. And 25 years later, here we are.
Yeah, so what was the subject of this work? You were at the time training to do clinical psychology.
Yeah, I have a kind of a windy path. I trained as a clinical psychologist. My PhD was in clinical psychology, but I was mentored by a social psychologist. And so my first job was an assistant professor in clinical psychology, and I very quickly moved to social psychology, and from there, pretty quickly to cognitive science, and then to neuroscience, cognitive neuroscience, affective neuroscience, and now I would say I equally split my time between engineering and evolutionary biology. But what I noticed was the assumption of the day was really that emotion categories like anger, sadness, fear, and so on were physical types, that every time you feel angry, the same thing happens in your body and in your brain, and the same thing would happen in my body, my brain, and we would make the same facial expressions, and then everybody around the world, barring error, right, or regulation, would pretty much be showing the same patterns. And that's not what we saw at all. And I would say again and again and again in the early work, I just noticed that the stimuli that were the events that were supposed to trigger emotions often didn't work. People often people felt things they weren't, supposed to feel based on the dominant theory, that people didn't scowl when they were angry or smile when they were happy. Often they smiled when they were angry, and sometimes they would scowl, when they were enjoying a really bad joke. So we just kept noticing again and again and again this variation. And in psychology, the typical assumption is that kind of variation is probably something wrong with your method or maybe something wrong with your measurement tools. But we took another path, really.
Yeah, so your work seems to buck against a trend that's dominant in the behavioral sciences, and that you in your talk said has been, maybe for over 100 years, has been one of the default assumptions in psychology, that what we're looking at are actually types in the real world. They're natural, what philosophers would call natural kinds.
Yeah, so I would say that there's one way of thinking about a biological category, or a category is just an instance. It's just a group of things which are similar in some way. A biological category, like a species, right? There's or a psychological category, which is probably also a biological category, like anger, right? One idea is that all of the instances share some common set of physical features, right? So for a species, the idea would be all dogs or all Cocker Spaniels have the same set of features. There's like an ideal form of a Cocker Spaniel. And any variation in coat thickness or color or tail length or snout length or whatever is all kind of irrelevant, noise. That was a very pre-Darwinian view of a species. And then Darwin came along and observed tremendous variability in the individuals in a species and posited that variation is basically the raw material that is used by the environment to select individuals, basically to facilitate their differential reproduction, which we know is natural selection. And so philosophers of biology look at On the Origin of Species and recognize that Darwin was introducing a different philosophy of science. Instead of thinking about types, he was thinking about biopopulations, that a category of instances are not a set of things which are all similar in a physical way, but they are similar maybe in a functional way, but their physical properties can vary. And so, Ernst Mayr, the evolutionary biologist, referred to this as population thinking, or I call it a population mindset. And, philosophers of biology write that this was Darwin's insight was the first step to vanquishing 2,000 years of essentialism in our understanding of the natural world. Essentialism being the belief that things in a category, biological category, have some immutable, unchangeable, common essence that makes them what they are. And in psychology, there's really been a belief that psychological categories are types. And people have come along and made the observation that, in fact, William James, for example, talked about anger. He basically wrote, there is no entative sense of anger. Different instances of anger will look different in your body and feel differently.
From my own other experiences of anger.
Yeah, exactly. And actually, James, who was considered to be one of the founders of American psychology, cautioned against essentialism, cautioned against using common sense ideas about types. In typological thinking, you believe, like if you have a distribution, let's say you have some distribution of individuals, the mean of the distribution you assume is true, and variability around the mean is, around the statistical summary is error. But in population thinking, the variation is true and the mean is an abstraction that's not real in nature. It's just a sort of a useful fiction. And so William James basically was using Darwinian ideas about population thinking without calling it that. In fact, he has these beautiful passages about emotion where he basically says just that. Wundt, actually, in Germany, was suggesting something similar, but people didn't listen. And so early psychologists went looking for types, the physical features that define anger or define sadness or define fear, and couldn't find them. And so there's been this constant cycle of looking for types, not finding them, considering maybe the variation is real, and then something happens where typological thinking reasserts itself. And we're sort of, I would say, depending on how you count, on the second or third iteration of that.
Yeah, there's some new tool, genetics, functional neuroimaging, that...
Machine learning, right?
Yeah.
So in one of my presidential columns for the Association for Psychological Science, I sort of wrote about a parody of the way that people use machine learning right now. I mean, machine learning is a great tool. Brain imaging is a great tool. We have a lot of really sophisticated tools. What we need are sophisticated questions to match the sophisticated tools that we have. If we take really sophisticated tools and ask really simplistic questions that aren't realistic, then we're going to get answers that don't really matter too much.
In your talk, you also said that James asked us to look for the structure of the variation and to find general causes that might be the reason why that variation is structured in that way. an investigation of those causes might give us real tractable theories for understanding things like individual differences. I'm wondering, though, it seems like the way that psychology has been set up, the types of questions we asked, the way that we conceptualize the human brain and body as a stimulus response system might be an impairment in us finding these general causes. We might not be able to locate them in that way.
Well, not everyone believes in the hypothesis of general causes. I mean, that certainly was James's view. I mean, I think I can remember the quote. Science of psychology should be identifying the basic ingredients of the mind and the corresponding basic functions of the brain, or something like that. But the general idea is that there are likely a set of general causes that cut across the folk categories that we hold very dear, like cognition, types of emotions, types of perceptions, types of actions. That there's some kind of underlying set of processes that are common, like common ingredients. Like in your pantry, you can find, you have flour and salt and sugar, and you have water in your kitchen, and you can use those as ingredients to make lots of different foods, and even to make glue and stuff that's not edible, right? They're common ingredients. And so James's view was that maybe there are a set of common ingredients. Not everybody, I think, in psychology really holds that view, but some people do. And recent developments in neuroscience in particular suggest that that is distinctly possible.
And you used a lot of fundamental work that's been done over the past few decades in biology, in phylogenetics, to trace out these general causes, not just for human beings, but for all animals with nervous systems.
Yeah, so I have a collaborator who you know well. Her name is Barbara Finley. She's a developmental and evolutionary neuroscientist. And one of the things I learned from her is that it's really, you're thinking about how a brain works. You also have to think about how it's developed and also how it evolved. And one of the things that we know is that, brains, for example, didn't evolve, for the purposes of like seeing and, feeling and thinking. They evolved, among other reasons, to control your body. And actually, if you look evolutionarily, you can see that sensory systems, like vision and audition, and even the visceral systems of your body, or of a body,
which are a type of sensation themselves.
They give off a type of sensation themselves, actually evolved at the same time as the brain. Actually, the neurons, the part of the neural crest from which neurons that make the brain are born, also give rise to your heart, your cardiovascular system, your gut, your whole GI system. And at the same time, this is when we see animals developing eyes for modern, basically
visual systems.
Visual systems. Yeah, but that we see in vertebrates, right? So vertebrates are. There's a whole suite of things. We think about vertebrates as being special because they have a backbone. We have a backbone, but actually there are a bunch of things that make vertebrates special, they seem to. All of these innovations seem to have occurred approximately, in evolutionary time at the same time. So probably, we're talking about the span of like a couple of a couple of hundreds of millions of years or whatever. Yeah, a million years. Yeah. But if you look at a brain from that perspective, what you can see, or the hypothesis that it gives you, is that brains evolved to control bodies. As bodies got bigger and able to move further, brains got bigger, and you developed other kinds of systems to help the brain do its job in controlling the body, and that's including seeing, and eventually, thinking and feeling. And many of the things that we give functions to, so we saw this fantastic talk by Pat Kuehl just now talking about a reward system in the brain, and people talk about dopamine being a reward system. Dopamine evolved to regulate metabolism. It has a basic function of regulating metabolism. So what this means, and actually a lot of scientists now think dopamine is for effort. Whenever your brain has to expend effort, what is effortful or metabolically costly, is when you move your body or you learn something new. Those are like the big expenses in the brain. So what this suggests is that metabolism and energy regulation may be a really basic function that is involved in reward and in feeling and maybe even in thinking and learning. I don't just mean circulating glucose levels. I'm talking about, you know, I'm talking about the energy regulation more generally. The way what a physiologist would call allostasis, which is the anticipating where the brain anticipates the needs of the body, whether that's glucose or salt or water or whatever, and attempts to meet those needs before they arise. Many of the neurotransmitters that we assign psychological functions to, like serotonin, dopamine, and so on, actually have very basic metabolic functions. Cortisol, which everyone seems to understand.
It's the stress hormone.
Yeah, it's not a stress hormone, actually. It is a hormone that is secreted during stress. But it has a metabolic function. The function of cortisol is to get glucose into your bloodstream very fast so that you know, your cells can metabolize it. And it is secreted more during stressful moments, but it's also secreted basically anytime your brain believes that your cells need glucose quickly.
Like when you wake up.
Like when you wake up, like when you exercise, like when you sit on a stage and talk to 3 people in the audience, you know. And so I think, you know, going back to William James, you know, James, I think, was cluing us into consider the fact that, or consider the hypothesis that some of the things that we assign individual functions to may actually have more basic functions and they play a role in all of these psychological phenomena, even if they don't have a one-to-one correspondence with those phenomena, right? So dopamine is not a reward neurotransmitter. It is a neurotransmitter that is important when people are engaged in actively, or when an organism is actively engaged in seeking a reward. But it also functions, you know, not during moments where reward is being sought, whenever anything effortful is required, for example.
It seems like there's something about the way that in which we're trained to talk about science, in the ways in which we're incentivized to publish science, that leads us to this type of essentialist thinking.
Yes. So I would say just a couple of things on that. First of all, you know, one of the things I talked about today is how we tend to think about the brain really as a mechanistic system where we stimulate it and it responds. We design experiments basically around that idea. In fact, our whole model of how a mind works and a brain works is basically this experimental model where we stimulate something and then we get a response. That allows us to run experiments quickly in the lab. We can run lots of experiments. We get to feel really scientific. We can publish papers. And papers right now are, you know, like a currency that you trade in for tenure or a grant or whatever. But to do the kind of science that requires, the kind of science that is required for population thinking, population mindset, you can't run 5 studies in a year and publish, you know, 10 papers a year. I mean, one study can take 2, 3, 5 years to run. And you wonder to yourself, well, how could you have a career that way? Well, you can. You just don't have a career like the kinds of careers we have now where we have to publish 20 papers a year. You know, there's a lot to say about that, but I guess the one thing I'll say is that doing science differently doesn't just mean designing experiments differently. It means really reconsidering the entire incentive structure. Maybe other sciences aren't like this, but in psychology, there's an arms race, right? The kind of CV that used to get you tenure now gets you a job. And the kind of CV that gets you a job, that used to get you a job, now gets you a postdoc. And some people won't even accept a graduate student into their lab if they don't have a publication. What is that, right? And I think also, if you look, there's a wonderful study, actually, that was done by Susan Gelman, which I wish I had time to talk about. Or what Susan Gelman did is she, in her lab, she looked at the kind of language, the kind of words that psychologists use when they write about phenomena. And she found that we use language to describe our observations that encourage people to believe in types, that encourage people to essentialize. It's called generic language. Generic language is sort of general language that leads you to gloss over variability, like, the sky is blue, or, anger is when your goals are blocked, or fear is when sadness is when you have a loss, and so on and so forth. Or, we talk about anger, like people will write about anger. Anger is a category of instances, but if you don't talk about an instance of anger, if you confuse the type with the token, what philosophers would call the token, or the instance, you're really encouraging people to essentialize. And that psychology is just full of that language. And it's not just psychologists. I mean, just to be fair, Darwin he wrote On the Origin of Species, which was this masterpiece of vanquishing essentialism. And then 13 years later, he wrote the most essentialized book about emotion, right? I mean, it's just like full of essentialism. And people will, anytime you read anything written by anybody who says that Darwin thought that emotional expressions were functional and evolved from natural selection, we should remind you that that person hasn't actually read Darwin, because that book doesn't even mention natural selection with respect to emotion. I think the phrase natural selection appears once in the entire book. Darwin believed that emotions evolved in a Lamarckian way, which is a highly essentialist view of evolution, and he thought they were vestigial. He didn't think they were functional. He thought, well, expressions one time in the past were functional, but they're not functional for humans now. Just like our tailbone is not functional. And his reason for writing about emotions in this way is he was trying to show use this as evidence that humans evolve from a common ancestor with other animals. So, but the point is that even Darwin, the great Darwin, actually succumbed to essentialism. We all struggle with it, in part because of our language, at least in the Western world, and also because of some of the assumptions that we have. But psychology is not special. Even biology, Ernst Mayr wrote that, Darwin vanquished essentialism. Well, yeah, until, people started working on genes and so biologists had to again discover and debate whether or not genes were like essences. And there was a long, very dramatic debate about that. I mean, I think by now we know the answer is no, and we're back to population thinking again. But it's a constant struggle that we have to guard against as scientists, I think.
So you're saying as new tools are introduced to gather evidence or to observe things about the human body or the human environment, it tempts us into essentialism.
I think, well, no. I think the way people are using the tools. So, for example, tomorrow, I'm part of a session on that deals with the question of whether or not emotional expressions are universal. And during that session, we'll talk a lot about how technology is being used. And, again, there's some pretty powerful technology out there, and it can be used to answer good questions, and in fact, actually, to really innovate the kinds of questions that can be asked now. Or it can be used to ask really simplistic questions. That there's nothing inherently wrong with the tools. In fact, the tools may give us an opportunity to finally observe people in ways that up until now has actually been really difficult to do. But that technology can be used to answer questions that are simplified in unhelpful ways. Just like machine learning. Machine learning can be used in a very productive way to answer productive questions, or it can be used in a very essentialist way to, where people use it with a lot of confirmatory bias. There's nothing inherently good or bad about a tool. It's really in how it's used.
I don't mean to essentialize the tools, for sure.
Yeah.
It sounds though that also the way that scientists do their work has changed a lot since Darwin's time. You read On the Origin of Species, and he's spending years and years just observing pigeon breeding and noting these careful variations in all these different types of animal life. But it seems like in today's age, we start with a question that we immediately try to answer. There's no room or time to observe that natural variation to convince ourselves that what we might see as the types that we're examining aren't actually so similar to, instance by instance.
I think that there's a grain of truth in what you're saying, in the sense that, in Darwin's time, you had gentlemen, you had gentlemen scientists, right, who didn't actually have to work for a living, and so, they had time to observe. Yeah, but I will say that there are really heroic scientists who spend their entire lives actually observing and in being inductive in their approach. But they are people who are willing to forego the immediate reward of that people often seek. So I guess, I don't mean to say that no one focuses on individual variation and no one does the deep kind of observation that's necessary in psychology. There are definitely people who do that, and the work is really beautiful.
Yeah.
But I think the incentive structure is not set up to encourage that, and there are a lot of reasons why that's the case. It's a complex system, but right now you really have to go against the grain, in a sense. You have to be patient. You have to fight. I mentioned this. I'll just say that, for example, almost 20 years ago, maybe 15 years ago now, I had this idea of how to use VR in combination with ambulatory physiological monitoring. I had an idea of getting a bunch of scientists together all over the world to develop VR scenarios where we could put our subjects in scenarios where they could move around, and we could monitor everything about them in very high dimensional detail in these artificial environments. And if you had a library of these, anybody anywhere in the world could actually, instantiate the same situation and put people from different cultures in the situation, or you could modify, as open source.
Open science a minute before its time, yeah.
Yeah, well, that was 15 years ago that I made that pitch to NSF, and I still don't see anybody actually doing that. It requires a level of cooperation and investment, and I really want to be really clear about this. I think behavioral scientists, like psychologists, do what they can given the amount of funding that they have. It seems kind of crass to mention, but in fact, it's just a reality of life. Yeah. We often run the studies we do because we do the best with what we have. We have to fight to get decent amounts of funding. What I like to tell people is, if physicists were funded at the level of behavioral scientists, do you think that anyone ever would have discovered the Higgs boson? I don't think so. And do you think if psychologists and other behavioral scientists had the amount of funding that physicists have, that we would be able to solve some of the problems that have been persistent for the last 150 years? I think the answer is yes. So I'm not trying to set us up in opposition to any other science. I'm just trying to say that there are many, many, many things which make it hard to do the kind of science that is needed, that is really necessary, if we actually want to make progress on the kinds of questions that the public needs us to make progress on.
Well, I thank you so much. I think we're out of time, but let's hope that while we're at AAAS, we can have these sorts of conversations with the stakeholders that'll make that type of work possible.
That would be great.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.